Government spending has exceeded revenue by about 200 billion rand this year, raising concerns that Treasury will have to borrow more to avoid a debt crisis. Now, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has already signaled that there is a possibility to borrow more to plug this particular gap. Citadel Chief Economist Maarten Ackerman joins us now to explain the benefits and perhaps even the mishaps of this particular approach. Now, Maarten, the minister says he'll borrow more to finance debt repayments and the budget deficit. Is this not borrowing from Peter to pay Paul? Are we not getting into a debt spiral?
Yeah, I think, good evening, we're very close to that. At the moment, the debt service cost is about 20% of the budget. So if we collect R1 of tax, 20 cents is going in terms of just servicing the debt. This is now the third biggest item in the budget. And if we continue borrowing to make ends meet, that can easily go to 25 or 30 cents, which means that there's just less money left for the really important stuff like education, healthcare, and the likes. So you're 100% right. You don't want to get into a stage where you actually need to borrow money just to pay the interest. And we're actually getting closer to that, which is a great concern for the budget altogether.
The country continues to face a fiscal crunch, Maarten, with the debt fast approaching the $5 trillion mark. What other options does Minister Godongwana have to face this particular budget deficit apart from borrowing?
Yeah, so borrowing is the easiest at the moment because, we can do it on a daily basis. The other options, we probably need to fix the economy to actually lift the tax revenue as a result of strong economic growth. Now, that can be done. They can definitely provide us with more incentives to get the economy going. There's definitely work on the ground in terms of trying to sort out some of the structural issues. But stronger growth is probably only possible, call it 3 years from now. So that's not really going to help the immediate pressure on the budget. So the other thing that can be done, but that's probably not very popular in an election year, is to think about increasing something like that, which is a tax that we pretty much know what we'll get from the day that they lift the tax rate. We'll get the income from the next day. And we can make the argument that, our VAT rate is still well below the average in Africa. So that's the other alternative, to start thinking about how we can actually increase the tax revenue, but from an economy that's already struggling. So, the best thing would be to actually get the economy going, not increasing tax rates, but just getting the benefit of that tax revenue coming through from a faster growing economy.
But how much room does Enoch Godongwana have to move, Maarten? Because when we look at the South African economy, it's not growing at all, below 1%, in fact. And finding the money to pour into this economy to get those jobs going and getting the economy active is not a real possibility right now, is it?
No, so I think, tomorrow's speech will probably be the balancing act to say, well, for the next 3 years, we need to look at cutting back expenses where we can, at least trying to cap expenses in terms of not adding further to, call it, the wage bill, which is one of the biggest items that we are facing. And while doing that, working on the longer term plan in the framework of 3 years to get the economy going without unnecessary increasing taxes now to cut the consumer and the business in terms of their ability to add to consumer growth. So it is that balancing act, and hopefully in the 3 years we can get to a more sustainable fiscal path, but it will need to be a combination from both sides. So working back the expenses and then get the economy going so that we can increase the revenue as a result.
Godongwana, as you made reference to, will have to cut spending ahead of elections next year in a country where spending on services and social program is a non-negotiable. So where is it safest to cut? Where should he be going for those particular cuts in order not to agitate even some of the members within his own party in the ANC?
Yeah, so if you look at this year, we haven't really budgeted for the 7.5% increase in February, which happened. So that added a lot to the expense side of the budget year to date. The other thing that's pretty much baked into the cake is, although it's only to the end of March, is the COVID social grants. But that's probably going to pave the way for a more permanent grant going forward. And then the debt servicing costs that we spoke about, that's also, that 20 cent is basically in the budget until we reduce the debt. So those three biggest expenses is not that easy to cut. But, if we can put a cap on further employment in the public sector and further, call it above inflation increases, then that will certainly help over the framework to keep expenses under control and that don't spiral out even further. And then it's to really get the economy going to add the revenue side to it. And by doing that, we'll get to a more sustainable fiscal framework.
Let's look at this approach further of borrowing. The Ricardian equivalence theory argues that using budget deficit or borrowing money to stimulate the economy exerts no effect at all. This is because, of course, the government will have to eventually increase taxes to pay off the current deficit. And that wouldn't work because our tax base is quite thin.
You're 100% right. That is the debt spiral they're talking about. So the minute you run into the environment where we just borrow money to pay interest, because then it's just, not moving forward whatsoever. The debt that you are using is just, call it, paying for non-productive parts of the budget. It is not really adding value in terms of increasing capacity in education or healthcare or the infrastructure and logistical network and things like that. And then typically also the risk increase for a country to start facing default, so that you're in a position where you can't further service the interest on your debt. So we definitely need to steer away from that. Like I said, we have got some window still before we get there. And during that window, that's why it's so important to make sure that we don't further increase expenses on unproductive spending, and ensure 100% that we actually create an economic base. Because I do think if we think about our tax system at the moment, a lot of our taxes are already quite high in terms of the rate, if you think about personal income tax. So that's already in place. Corporate tax is probably one where we can still think about changes. But the important thing is to actually get the economy growing. And by doing that automatically, we will get the revenue that we need, and that will address the shortfall that we are facing.
Well, that was Maarten Ackerman, Citadel's chief economist, breaking down some of the complexities that face Minister Godongwana.